a LitHub Radio podcast.
Hello, listeners. This is Brooke with a quick reminder that I have two amazing memoir classes coming up this spring. The first one is The Story of You, which I've shared about the last couple weeks, featuring Kiese Lehman, Mark Nepo, Joshua Moore, and Susan Liu as the extraordinary teachers that you will not want to miss. That one starts on March 4th and will be focused on tapping into discovery, inspiration, and ways to connect to yourself and your writing during these challenging times. Right after that class, Linda Joy Myers and I will be teaching What Made Maggie Smith's You Could Make This Place Beautiful a best-selling memoir. This is a 4-week class that starts on April 22nd. If you loved this book, and honestly, who didn't, join us to understand why it struck the nerve it did and how Maggie Smith's writing and her execution can impact your own writing and execution in ways that deepen what you're trying to achieve. This is part of our best-selling memoir series where we teach writers to be better memoirists by studying the works of great writers who've come before you, and this one is just $99. So check out the details for both classes at magicofmemoir.com. Hope to see you there. Hello, sleuths, would-be detectives, crime solvers, and watchers, and mystery enthusiasts of all sorts. Welcome to another episode of Right Minded. And today's a fun show, Grant, because our guest, Jean Kwok, has a reputation for her capacity to bring mystery and suspense into her literary fiction, which is very cool and not uncommon, but there's not a real genre for that. You know, it's neither literary nor is it certainly it's not mystery in the way that we think about, you know, a mystery trilogy or a cozy mystery. And the reality is, like, when you think about mystery, it is so often in that context. You have mystery novels, but there is this whole other aspect of mystery, which is about building tension for the reader, constructing complex narratives, and using narrative to gradually reveal hidden truths, often through multiple perspectives, often through unreliable narrators, and then also deeply buried family secrets. And so I'm excited to touch upon this theme today of books that are not traditional mysteries, and yet they create a sense of intrigue through this kind of layered storytelling. But it's not an easy thing to do.
No, definitely not an easy thing to do, but it's a necessary thing to do. And, you know, somebody once told me there was essentially one genre for all of fiction, that everything was an adventure story. And I think that that's true in its way. But I also think every story is a mystery as well, because a story really is a series of unanswered questions in a world full of uncertainty, and even the most plotless literary fiction should carry with it a sense of suspense around the answers to these questions.
Yeah, I like that. I like that idea of the adventure story, and it's really true. And our minds want that sense of intrigue in a story. And I know I've said this before on the show, but one of my favorite books of all times is Ian McEwan's Atonement. And I have never really thought of it before prepping for today's show, that the reason I liked it so much is because the book is actually a mystery. You know, like, you don't really know what's happening and you're unpacking it, and the protagonist is an unreliable narrator. You know, there's all the stuff that is included in that list I said, you know, the shifting perspectives, the gradual revelations, and that tension creation, right? Because in that story, 13-year-old Brianne Tallis misinterprets a romantic encounter between her older sister, Cecilia, and Robbie Turner, who is the son of a servant. And then that misunderstanding leads her to falsely accuse him of a crime, and that results in his imprisonment and exile to war-torn France, which is during World War II. And it's just a really interesting storyline, you know, that one thing that someone can do would have such a major consequence in the lives of so many people. And Jean writes this kind of fiction, you know, it's just fabulous storytelling. It will keep you wanting to stay up with a novel all night. And Grant, so I was just curious, as I was thinking about Ian McEwan and that story, you know, which I read years ago and it still stays with me. Do you have any favorite novels that blend mystery and literary fiction?
That's such a great question. We should make a big, long list of those novels. I'll venture The Secret History by Donna Tartt, which was one of those books that it seemed like everyone was reading when it came out. And it's a murder mystery, but told in reverse and focusing on why a crime happened rather than who committed it. But it's got, you know, a lot of heavy philosophical and psychological depth. And then there's the classic book I can't get enough of, really, The Talented Mrs. Ripley by Patricia Highsmith, which I've loved on the page and on the screen. And in fact, the most recent adaptation came out, I think, last year on Netflix. But it takes a really kind of quite different approach than the film that many people saw with Matt Damon and Jude Law. It's much more, what's black and white and very much more moody and gloomy. And it's just the perfect psychological thriller that explores identity and deception and morality through the mind of a sociopathic protagonist. And it's just, basically frightening as hell.
I watched that too. They did an amazing job, but that's right. And it's funny because I just think about the way that mystery gets a little bit of a bad rap, and yet we compulsively consume mystery, right?
Mm-hmm.
It reminds me of these kind of lowbrow, highbrow conversations that we've had in the past. But we're going to ask Jean Kwok about this in the interview. She was asked to contribute to a book called Marple, 12 New Mysteries. And that was a 2022 short story collection featuring Agatha Christie's beloved detective, Miss Marple, written by 12 contemporary female authors. I just love the concept for this so much. And undoubtedly, Jean was a candidate for this because of her ability to craft these intricate narratives that we've been talking about, the hidden truths. And she just has this great talent for weaving suspense into something that is very explicitly character driven. And so I'm excited that she's going to talk to us about that, and everybody gets to hear her answer. But Grant, it made me wonder if you've read much Agatha Christie. And I've only read Christie as an adult, actually in a few attempts to read the books to James when he was a little bit younger than he is now. But I do wonder what makes Christie's stories so lasting. Her legacy is incredible. Obviously, she's written something like 66 books, but I also wonder whether those are true mystery novels in the way that we think about the genre of mystery, or if they really are what we're talking about today, like literary mysteries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I shamefully haven't read Agatha Christie, and it's funny how we go through life as readers and, often have huge gaps in our reading lives. And when you said that you hadn't read her when you were young, I was wondering if that was the perfect time for me to read her. But I should make a point to do so. And I think it's fair to say, though, that, Christie's books, they're not literary fiction as we understand literary fiction today. So I did a little research, and she started writing in the 1920s. And interestingly, that was an era when classic detective fiction was really coming onto the scene in a big way. And classic detective fiction, they were mystery novels that followed a very particular structure and featuring a detective, an amateur or professional who methodically solves a crime, usually murder, by gathering clues and exposing the culprit. And it was a genre that just flourished in the late 19th century to the mid 20th century for some reason, and included, in addition to Miss Marple, Hercule Poirot, also written by Christie, Mrs. Bradley, written by Gladys Mitchell, and Miss Silver, written by Patricia Wentworth. And the characters tend to be, like I said, either these professional detectives or amateur sleuths. And one interesting fact, and possibly well known to some listeners, is that Angela Lansbury's character in Murder, She Wrote was deeply inspired by Miss Marple.
Right. Of course it was. I loved that show. My mom watched it religiously all the years I was growing up, but I never knew that when I was a kid. I didn't know that it was inspired by Agatha Christie. Maybe I should have. Like I mentioned, Christie wrote 66 detective novels, which is very impressive, in addition to short stories and numerous plays. So it just made me excited that Jean was invited to do a modern take on this character. And so anybody who is a Christie fan, it's sort of a must read. And one of the things I'll say about Christie, having read her pretty recently, is that her language is incredible. When I read someone like Christie, I think it shows us a little bit what we've lost in our vocabulary as a modern culture. I had to actually look up words, that's how incredible she is. And just the depth into which she gets, the characters and all of the plot, and the language itself is quite a treat. So I just wanted to say that. But Grant, one of the things I couldn't stop thinking about in preparation for this episode was how seemingly impossible it would be for that kind of book, like this kind of crime detective mystery novel, to be done if you're a pantser. It just, the whole thing feels like it has these very tight structures and conventions. And it also seems like something that writers have to learn, you have to adhere to. And I know there are a lot of conferences, there are thriller conferences, there are mystery conferences. And I think part of the reason for that is because because these writers have to learn a very structured approach to storytelling. And again, when we get to Jean's interview, she says multiple times, like, I know what I'm doing, I have it figured out. I'm in the driver's seat. Those were my words, but still, she says, I'm not flailing around. Right. And it can't be easy, but it is like a brain puzzle. And it has to be satisfying for the reader. And so, Grant, I know I asked you to look up a few tips on how to break into mystery writing. So what did you find?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about the pantsing. The only thing I can see pantsing work as a kind of exploratory draft, to kind of feel out the world and kind of brainstorm the possibilities. But definitely structure matters a lot in mystery as a genre. And I know this because my wife Heather's actually been writing her first mystery for the past few years. So she's gone to conferences and she's been studying those craft elements and reading a lot of mysteries. And here are through her lens, her filter, here top 4 tips. So as with any genre, study the classic and modern mysteries. So yeah, read Agatha Christie, especially Murder on the Orient Express, her classic, and Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes, and Dorothy Sayers. Strong Poison is a great one. Analyze how contemporary writers structure their mysteries. This is so important. I did this a lot as a literary fiction writer too, but think of Tana French, Anthony Horowitz, Louise Penny, some of the classics, contemporary authors as well. And then pay attention to how and when clues are placed throughout the narrative. Jean actually talks about this, how she had a pivotal point happen at the 75% mark and she kept trying to get it to the 50% mark. So outline with that classic mystery structure. So you introduce the crime early on, usually in the first act. You establish suspects and motives. Everyone should have a reason to be guilty, no one gets off the hook. You drop clues and red herrings throughout, and then it all leads to this dramatic revelation where the detective explains how they solved the crime in the end. Kind of like Scooby-Doo, if you've only watched Scooby-Doo, right? But anyway, it takes a lot of practice, I think, to do this, or it would for me. So you practice writing clues and red herrings, and, one thing is, this is a good tangible tip. Try writing a short mystery scene where you plant, 3 real clues and 2 misleading ones, and then have someone else read it and see if they can solve the mystery before the reveal. Lean on your writing buddies. And the 4th one here is just to experiment with different narrative styles. Like if you think about it, some are written in the first person, kind of detective point of view, such as The Big Sleep by Raymond Chandler. Some mysteries are written in the third person with shifting perspectives. I'm thinking of Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn. And then there's the epistolary documentary style, which is, I'm going to recommend The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. So I think that's plenty for people to bite off now to start. But I'm going to try some of this.
This is great, Grant. And I want to say, as a plug for our Substack, we are going to actually write this stuff into the Substack because we do want listeners to come and check out the Right Minded Substack. We have one. We talk about it every once in a while, but we put some bonus content in there. So Heather's 4 great ideas are going in our Substack this week. So do go look. And then, of course, consider taking a class with Jean Kwok. She will be back at the Hawaii Writers Conference in November, as will Grant. So that's a twofer that you really don't want to miss. I was just in Kauai, as we're going to say, with Jean last November. It's a great conference, really worth it. So we will be back momentarily and predictably, as it turns out, after this not at all suspenseful or tension-filled musical break. Welcome back, everyone. We're so pleased to have Jean Kwok with us today. Jean is the award-winning New York Times and international best-selling author of Searching for Sylvie Lee, Girl in Translation, Mambo in China, and The Leftover Woman. Her work has been published in 20 countries and has been taught in universities, colleges, and high schools across the world. Jean has been chosen for numerous honors, including the American Library Association Alex Award, the Chinese American Librarians Association Best Book Award, and Orange New Writers title. Also, I want to say, Jean, that you and I were in Kauai recently. You're an amazing teacher. Your work has been featured in a television documentary, and you are soaring. I just love to see you again, and welcome.
Brooke, thank you so much. I'm just so enjoying being here, and it was wonderful to get to hang out with you in Kauai as well.
I agree. And, I want to start by asking a question about mystery as an element in your fiction. By all accounts, you're a literary novelist, but you integrate mystery elements into your fiction and you really consciously structure your stories with suspense in mind. So I hoped we could open there and ask you about the difference between the kind of fiction you write and straight up mystery, and do these distinctions matter that much to you?
I think that there's kind of craft, and that is just what it is. And you utilize your craft. It's like having a toolbox and having a screwdriver. You can use that screwdriver in so many different ways. And when I think of mystery, I think that mystery has a lot to do with stakes and with pacing. And my first novel, Girl in Translation, was really just a coming of age, purely literary novel with no bodies or anything like that. And since then, I have moved more into indeed literary suspense. And I would say that it's not something you can really categorize in a hard way. I think that as you develop as a writer, you start to learn things that for you make it easier to tell the kind of stories you want to tell, that kind of help you take your readers on the emotional journey you want to take them on. And a part of that for me is really pacing and structure. And I can use that for mystery, indeed, which have been my last couple of books. But I actually also just sold a romantasy trilogy, which is due in 2 days, book one, in 2 days. And it's a sign of how much I absolutely love you. And I'm so honored to be here, that I am actually here because I have canceled everything else. But, I'm using the same tools. That is obviously a fantasy romance and different from a thriller mystery, but a lot of things are surprisingly the same.
Well, Jean, I want to dig deeper into the use of those tools, as you called them, because I know that you taught a master class on narrative design at the Kauai Writers Conference, and I'm just going to guess that you're a plotter as opposed to a pantser, and so I wonder if you can share a bit more about narrative design as a topic or subject, and why is narrative design something novelists should understand or study?
Well, I definitely am a plotter in the sense that I am constantly moving away from my book to try to figure out what the heck I'm doing. And, it's a hard task. I am not a plotter in the sense that I have writer friends who can plot out a whole book and execute it. And I am so envious of them. I think they're so brilliant that they can do that. I'm a person who will flail around and spend a huge amount of time attempting to plot out my book. And then I'll start to write it and be like, oh my God, no, the whole thing is no good, and just toss it all. And then I have to go and replot it and replot it and replot. But I am definitely not a pantser. I would say that. I used to be much more of one, but then, a little thing happened called being published and having a career. And it just, for me, was impossible to continue being a pantser and to have the kind of production and have the kind of career that I wanted to have. I am a full-time writer, and I have been since my debut novel. So when I'm a plotter, what that means is that I do spend a lot of time thinking about the initial conception of the book. I do know a lot about craft and book structure, but I'm also a backwards outliner. And what I mean by that is that it's not that so much that I outline ahead, although I do, but what I do is I outline back. So I will write what I need to write, and I'll go back and I'll look at what I've done. And I will be like, oh my gosh, well, that was a very long section with nothing happening whatsoever. Maybe that's why that felt a little bit slow. So I will look at my book in those ways to try to improve the experience for myself and for my readers.
That's so interesting, Jean, because I wanted to ask about this a little bit more. This idea of like complex narrative structure more generally. When you have these levels of complexity and you're building tension, I'm curious about learning this, and especially because this is something that you teach. Is there room for people to break out of sort of like the traditional constructs and molds that exist for doing that kind of slow build tension, or do you feel like you really need to learn an explicit and specific way of doing it and then stick to that way of doing it?
Oh, no. I mean, I don't think you need to stick to anything. In my last novel, The Leftover Women, there's a really big twist in it. And the twist was supposed to happen at the midpoint. And whatever I did, that twist kept landing at the 75% point. And there was just no way for me to set it up so that the twist landed at 50% like I wanted it to land. And, it's fine. The book is great. I love the book. I'm very happy with the book. And it developed the way it needed to develop. But I do know that. I'm not someone who's like, oh, I wrote this book and all this stuff happened in it. And this is one of the things I do teach my students, that if somebody asks you, what is your book about? And you're like, well, this happened and that happened and then that happened and then that happened. That might mean there's a lack of focus in your work that you might need to address. I think that it is important to be aware of yourself and your work and what you're doing. And I ask people who do not want to be aware to not take my class. It is an advanced class, and I ask people to look at their work and step back and take a look at what am I really doing? And if I can't say clearly what I'm really doing, then maybe I'm not doing it as effectively as I can be or I should be. There are 1 million books being published every single second. And it's hard, it's hard to get people's attention. It's hard to have the kind of backing that you want to have when you put out something that you love and that you think is really good. But back to your question, Brooke, which was excellent, of do we need to stick to something or do we go our own way? I think that it's important to have knowledge and to say, okay, I know that here are the choices for what I could do with this narrative. And I know that I am deviating, as in my midpoint twist came at 75% point. I know this. I'm not like, oh, I just wrote this thing and I'm not really sure what it is. I know exactly what is happening in my book. That was a choice I made. I made it consciously. I stand behind that choice. But I'm a believer in knowing what you're doing and not just kind of, winging it and then hoping that everything turns out well.
Well, Jean, I'm going to go a little bit different direction here. Many of your protagonists navigate between two worlds, culturally, linguistically, and personally. And I know you speak multiple languages and you lived in Amsterdam for many years. So I'm curious about the role of two worlds in your fiction and whether this is a hallmark or just something that sneaks in, its ways, given the life that you actually live.
I think that we all write for a reason that we cannot easily define. And really, none of us were like, oh, I know an easy way to get famous and rich. Let's become a writer. It's like, if you thought that, you are really barking up the wrong tree. I think that we're all passionate and driven to write for reasons of our own that may not always be clear to us, and that we have themes that we are drawn to and that we love to come back to in different ways for whatever reason. And indeed, as you so astutely said, Grant, I love to write about two different worlds and people who straddle those worlds. I love bringing writers and readers into places that they might not have been so they can see the world from a different place. And I especially love using the power of a narrative to bring somebody into someone else's mind. And regardless of skin color, gender, whatever, you are suddenly so intimately in the soul of a different person. And I think that that is a power that we have as novelists that I love to employ in all of my work.
Well, Jean, your bio, which I read, notes that you have been taught, that your work has been taught in schools across the world. And I'd love to hear more about this. Like, what makes your novels particularly teachable? And is there an anecdote that you might share about a particular school, especially like in a non-US country? I'm so curious about that, or a story that comes to mind that was moving to you.
Well, it is an incredible honor to have my work be taught across the world. And I guess one of the most moving things I ever received was a whole set of videos from a school in Bolivia. And the students had all filmed themselves. They were learning English and they had filmed themselves talking about what my book meant to them. And it was just to see these faces and to realize that my book had somehow connected with this school in Bolivia. It was amazing. And so that is great. I think in terms of teachability, I think it is because I have a real awareness of structure. So even though I have become increasingly aware as I've developed as a writer, I have always had a clear idea about unity of theme and metaphor and purpose. So when I write a book, it is a whole. And what I mean by that is that I will not use, let's say, the metaphor of water in a certain way and then completely deviate from it in a non-thematic way at the end. I'm not doing it randomly. It's something I've thought about, and it's something that I do pretty consciously. At least when I go back and I revise, I am aware of what I'm doing. So I guess awareness is kind of the theme of what I do as a writer and that I try to teach. So my books are teachable because, hopefully they're about things that people care about and speak to people, but they also are clean in the sense that I am not flailing around like a person doing free dance in a room by themselves. I have been trained and I use my training when I write.
Well, Jean, I was poking around on Goodreads before you came on today, and you've got a super impressive presence there. You've got 4 books with over 20,000 reviews, and then Girl in Translation has nearly 60,000. And I'm just curious, how does that happen? And can you explain how you understand Goodreads to work? Like, is there a code you've cracked, and how do you get that kind of visibility, and how can I get it then?
Grant, I have to tell you that I did not know this until you just told me.
You cracked it.
I might not be, thank you, but I did not know that. I love Goodreads, but I am so busy that I just don't have time to really look. So I'm so glad that's true. Thank you. I think that I do think Goodreads is really important. And I know authors that actively cultivate their presence on Goodreads by responding, by all of those things. I think that my teams have done an incredible job of promoting my books on Goodreads. And I do think that it's one of the places where, if, let's say, I were to invest money in my own publicity, I think that doing something like a Goodreads giveaway is a powerful tool to gain an audience on Goodreads. I know this because it was done for me, and I know that my numbers would jump after they did it. They would run a giveaway and give away, 50 copies, 100 copies. And I would just see the number of people interested in the book and who ultimately kind of would come back and hopefully buy the book or leave review for the book. That would increase tremendously thanks to things like that. And I have been lucky because I've been a Goodreads Choice Award for, I think, 3 out of 4 books, something like that. And that has really been due to, I think, 2 things. One is having an amazing team. And the other thing that I think that people really can think about when they're writing, when they're starting, is how easy is it to communicate what's awesome about your book. And I think that having an easy, powerful one-liner, at most 2-liner, that can say what this book is about, is an essential part of an author's toolkit if you can manage to do it.
Wow, that is a great piece of advice, actually, because it's so in line with what you've been talking about this whole time, like know what you're talking about, know what you're doing, and really be in the driver's seat. So thanks for that, simple but important. And Jean, in closing, I wanted to ask you to tell us about being asked to write an authorized original Miss Marple story by the Agatha Christie estate, which is very, very cool. How did that come about? And can you share a little bit about what it was like to decide what story you'd write for that collection?
That was really a tremendous honor. I was very lucky in that I was approached to do it. They were looking for 12 contemporary authors, and I was one of the ones they asked. When I started to kind of draft the idea, I spend my whole life, I feel like I'm running in front of a herd of buffalo trying to survive. It's like people are like, why don't you get an assistant? I'm like, I would, except I'm almost being stampeded to death by this herd of buffalo behind me.
We're almost done here, Jean, by the way. We're almost done.
We're part of the herd.
No. I love being here with you guys. But basically, when they asked me to write that story, I was also under deadline for a novel. And I was just like, I don't know what I'm doing. Like, I want to do this, but I have a deadline for a book. And what should I do? And how am I going to do this? And the editor for that Miss Marple collection was just so amazing and so brilliant. And she was like, well, how about we just get on the phone and have a little chat? I'm like, okay, I can do that. And we went on, and I was like, well, I was thinking blah, 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 blah. And she was like, okay. And after that, she wrote it up and she said, is this accurate to what you want to do? And I was like, yes, thank you so much for doing this. But the main thing that was interesting was that I, of course, wanted to be true to the Miss Marple character, but I also did want to reinvigorate her in a way, bring her into the modern world of diversity and color and different cultures. And so I had said, what do you think about possibly putting her on a cruise to Hong Kong? And, I thought they're going to be like, oh my God, she never leaves England. So, that would be a really big departure. But actually, Agatha Christie's great-grandson loved the idea. And he was immediately like, oh my God, can we actually even see her in Hong Kong? We would just so love to see that. And to have that kind of support was fantastic. And to feel like that they understood what I was trying to do with Ms. Marple. And then, of course, I wanted to be true to the character, but she's waltzing in my story. She is, she's on this cruise ship. And of course, everywhere Miss Marple goes, bodies start to fall. And she is, she's stuck on this cruise ship while these things are happening, but she has dim sum. She lands in Hong Kong, and it was just so wonderful to be allowed to write an iconic character in this new, fresh way.
Super cool. I love it. It's a little bit like fan fiction, except it's elevated and you're being invited to do it. So what a fun construct. Well, Jean, thank you for joining us while you're on deadline. It's great to be with you, and good luck with all the things you're doing.
Thanks so much, Jean.
Thank you so much for having me, guys. It's been so much fun.
We will be right back with this week's Substacking.
Well, Grant, today's Substacking is actually an announcement that I made earlier this month, and I wanted to share it with all of our listeners because our listeners are part of our writing community, and what happens with you and I in other parts of our working lives definitely has ripple effects into Right Minded and the content we bring to the show. So, Grant, it happened. She Writes Press is now part of the Stable Book Group.
Woohoo! That's so great, Brooke. I know it was a long time coming, so huge congratulations. It was dramatic for me to get your text from Mexico and kind of get a preview of the news, and I was so excited for you. So big congratulations.
Thank you, Grant. It has been a long time coming, and I thought sharing on an episode about mystery and tension was not an imperfect fit because, there was plenty of that for me on this journey. And notably, anytime that you're going through a big merger acquisition, there's so much you can't share and you can't say, understandably, of course, right? Mm-hmm. But the problem with that is that it's not my style at all. Like, I really am an open book, and I interact with my authors all the time. I have weekly office hours and close relationships. I was traveling to Kauai. I was down in Mexico. My authors were everywhere. So not to speak about what was happening, on top of the fact that there were a lot of twists and turns, has made me feel in some ways like I am living inside of a mystery, not totally knowing which way things were going to go. But ultimately, this was the outcome that I had hoped for. And so it does feel pretty great to be on the other side of it.
Yeah, that's so great, Brooke. And it's hard, definitely. I'm like you. It's super hard to be in transition. I want to tell everything all the time, it seems like. And I know from your other writing on Substack that you were writing about thresholds and kind of hinting at all of this for some time. And now you're able to scream it from the rooftops. And so I'm curious, what should our listeners know about your new partnership and role with the stable?
Yeah, the easy answer is that She Writes Press is now part of the Stable Book Group, and I'm taking a role as COO. The book group in publishing is also known as a publishing group. It's basically just a group of publishers who join together as a collective for the sake of cooperation, for saving costs. It's basically a consolidation, right? Mm-hmm. It's a merger. During my time at Seal Press, we operated under two book groups, actually. So when I was hired in 2004, the imprint was under the Avalon Publishing Group. And then later in 2007, we were acquired by the Perseus Books Group. Random House Publishing Group, I think, is the largest existing book group. It has 18 imprints. So this is a pretty common structure for book publishers. And it does help with things like shared resources and efficiencies. So it's important that I state that I will continue to be the publisher of She Writes Press. So for me, this is really just a way, to be collectively better off. It's about visibility and gaining more industry attention, which results in more book sales. So that's the rationale.
Yeah. Well, you've had a long partnership with the publicity firm BookSparks, and for the past 10 years, She Writes Press and your other imprint, Spark Press, have been part of Spark Point Studios. So does that mean that relationship is over?
Only insofar as the publishing entities are severing from SparkPoint, but we will continue to have a super strong relationship with BookSparks and Crystal Patriarch, who is the CEO of SparkPoint Studio and BookSparks. Really, it's been a great 10 years of growth for both companies. It's been a good partnership. BookSparks is a fantastic publicist if anybody is looking for a publicist. And, we're very lucky that although this move is about separating the businesses, we're doing it in a way that serves the authors and continues our partnership. I absolutely want to acknowledge that She Writes Press would not be where it is today without Crystal or BookSparks and all of the amazing talent that team has brought to the growth of the imprints. It for sure takes a village. So happy that we will be, doing all of this amicably.
Yeah, well, it also takes staying open to change and keeping your sights set on the future. So kudos to you, Brooke, for always, being open to change, because change can be pretty scary, especially when things are going, more or less well already.
Yeah, isn't that the truth? I mean, I've thought about that a lot. It's why people stay in relationships that aren't really working anymore or that are just fine. You hear that, like, we're fine. People get stuck in jobs, people grow roots in jobs. And there's a saying, don't fix what ain't broken. And I actually abide by that sometimes. But there's another important truth about growth, which is that you have to take chances and you have to trust your gut and sometimes take leaps of faith. And if you're feeling that feeling like something more is out there, it's kind of hard to ignore if it starts, knocking at your door and being like, answer me.
There's a lot to think about in that one little response you gave.
Yeah.
Well, congrats again, Brooke, and I'll be eager to see you settle into the stable, and as your imprints will, soon be off to the races, especially. And I'll be interested to hear what lessons you can bring to our listeners, because new ventures bring on new learnings. But gratitude is an old lesson, so I just want to thank all of you for listening and for leaving comments and ratings and for writing us with suggestions and questions and telling us how and when you listen to Right Minded. It's really creative fuel for us. So thank you, and we'll see you next week.